Hello. Thanks for being with us. Today I'd like to ask the question, when is the rapture? There's confusion in the church today over whether the rapture will occur before or after the Great Tribulation. I'd like to make it clear from the beginning that I firmly believe that Christians will go through tribulation. There will be no pre-tribulation rapture. The pre-tribulation rapture theory is accepted by many Christians, but the birth of this theory was developed in error and has been further perpetuated by a misunderstanding of the definition of tribulation as opposed to the term wrath of God. The initial development of the pre-tribulation theory sprung up in the 1800s by a minister named Darby. As the story goes, the minister was attending a church service, and a woman prophesied concerning the end-time rapture. Exactly what she prophesied is not really clear, but the minister apparently believed that her prophecy stated that God's people would not suffer the pouring out of the wrath of God. Darby was intrigued with the concept and went home and studied the prophecies of the Bible and came to the conclusion of two things. His first assumption was that God's people would not suffer the wrath of God. This was correct. The other conclusion Darby came up with was that the Great Tribulation and the wrath of God were one and the same, that they were identical with each other. This part of Darby's conclusion was incorrect. But because Darby believed that the Great Tribulation referred to in Matthew 24 was identical with the wrath of God, he therefore surmised that Christians would not suffer tribulation. After coming to these two conclusions, the one part correct and the other part incorrect, Darby began to preach his new doctrinal conclusions. This doctrine caught on not because it was true, but because of the inaccuracy of the definitions of tribulation and wrath of God. People quickly agreed that God would not pour his wrath upon his own righteous people. They didn't stop to question the fact as to whether or not the Great Tribulation and the day of the Lord's wrath were one and the same. Now, if the wrath of God and the Great Tribulation were identical, then Darby's assumption could readily be accepted. I don't know of anyone who thinks that God would pour out his wrath upon his own righteous people. But the Bible teaches us that Christians will endure tribulation, and that tribulation comes from wicked sources against Christians, not from God. Even Jesus, speaking to his disciples in Matthew 24, is telling them that tribulation is coming upon God's people, and that it is coming from wicked sources who want to destroy the work of the gospel. What does come from God is his wrath, which is poured out upon the wicked. So, how do we know for certain that the Great Tribulation and the wrath of God are two completely separate events? Actually, this is very easy to determine. Scripture shows us that the Great Tribulation and the wrath of God are two completely separate things which are separated by one major event. This event is the event that takes place at the opening of the sixth seal in Revelation 6, verses 12 and 13. Which is the darkening of the sun and moon and the stars falling from heaven. This event is mentioned in the Bible many times. According to Scripture, the Great Tribulation takes place before this event, and the wrath of God takes place afterward. We find part of the description for this in Matthew 24:29, where it says that the event of the sun and moon darkening will take place after the tribulation. This gives us a starting order of events, which first is the Great Tribulation, and then following that, the sun and moon being darkened and the stars falling from heaven. Now we'll go to Joel chapter 2, verse 31, where it shows that the day of the Lord, when he pours out his wrath upon the wicked, takes place after the sun and moon are darkened and the stars fall from heaven. Remember, we just read in Matthew 24:29 that the Great Tribulation happens before the sun and moon are darkened. And now we will read the verse that shows that the day of the Lord's wrath takes place after the sun and moon are darkened. Listen to this verse in Joel chapter 2. It reads, "The sun shall be turned into darkness, and the moon into blood, before the great and terrible day of the Lord comes." Notice that the verse said that the sun and moon will be darkened and the stars will fall from heaven before the great and terrible day of the Lord comes. This is very important because now we have an order to the events which shows that the great tribulation comes first, then the sun and moon are darkened and the stars fall from heaven. Then comes the great and terrible day of the Lord. By this we can clearly see that the great tribulation and the day of the Lord's wrath are two completely separate things, for they are separated by the event of the sun and moon darkening and the stars falling from heaven. Initially, back in the 1800s in England, when Darby heard the woman prophesy, he was under the incorrect assumption that the Great Tribulation was the event referred to in Scripture as the wrath of God, which will be poured out on the wicked during the great and terrible day of the Lord, mentioned in Joel chapter 2. And because he knew, as well as we know today, that God will not pour out his wrath on his own righteous people, he assumed incorrectly that the church would have to be taken out of the world before the Great Tribulation, thinking that this Great Tribulation was the wrath of God. And this assumption of his gave rise to the doctrine of a Pre-Tribulation Rapture theory, which many people have accepted and which has been further embedded in people's minds by the recent Left Behind series of novels and movies. And the reason this erroneous doctrine is accepted so easily is that people are told that the Great Tribulation is the same thing as the wrath of God. And then they are told that God will not pour out his wrath on his own people. When a person doesn't know Scripture, they will usually agree very quickly that God will not pour out his wrath upon his own righteous people, but they will never stop to realize that the Great Tribulation is different than the day of the Lord's wrath. The part of Scripture which tells us that God will not pour out his wrath on his own righteous people is true, but the part that says that the Great Tribulation is the same thing as the wrath of God is false.